Anyway, let's. I want to talk about one story real quick before we move to our conversation with Professor Carl Hart. And it is the story out of New Jersey. I think it's fascinating. New Jersey has effectively legalized recreational marijuana on Monday, following voters' approval of marijuana legislation in the November general election. Though medicinal marijuana is already legal and for sale in New Jersey, it's still going to take months to work out through all the regulations and licensing before recreational sales can begin. Even with that wait, many are hopeful that the passage of the bill will immediately begin to reduce the number of people, mostly people of color, black people, who will be charged with marijuana-related crimes and processed through this injustice system. And I want to read a quote from it. It says from Governor Murphy in a statement on Monday, and this is what they said: "Our current marijuana prohibition laws have failed every test of social justice, maintaining a status quo that allows tens of thousands, disproportionately people of color, to be arrested in New Jersey each year for low-level drug offenses is unjust and indefensible." Amal Sinha, the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union of New Jersey, responded to the passage of the bill with a statement saying, quote, "With Governor Murphy's signature, the decades-long practice of racist marijuana enforcement will begin to recede. Our state's cannabis laws can set a new standard for what justice can look like." Operative word is can. Joining us now is Dr. Carl Hart. He was a neuroscientist and professor of neuroscience and psychology at Columbia University. He is the author of the recent book, Drug Use for Grownups, which he is described, quote, "I wrote this book to present a more realistic image of the typical drug user, a responsible professional who happens to use drugs in his pursuit of happiness." Dr. Hart, thank you so much for joining this morning. How are you?
Thank you for having me. I'm good, man.
Good. My first encounter with your work was this summer, and you wrote an op-ed for the New York Times that we discussed. I had a chance to interview you on we know how George Floyd died. It wasn't because of drugs. And I want to frame this entire conversation in that context because it is, you started exploring and explaining, rather, to us the long legacy of racism in drug use, drug policy, and how it affects Black people in particular. Could you just frame that conversation from the perspective of how even still to this day, they are trying to convince or trying to spin this narrative that if George Floyd had not been on X drug, he would not have died, even though we look at the video and our eyes show us why he died was because of the police state?
Yeah, so we have a long history of using drugs as a scapegoat in order to let police get off with police brutality. I mean, this goes all the way back from the early 1900s, 1800s until this day. I mean, George Floyd had some drugs in his systems. I think he had fentanyl, methamphetamine, and marijuana in his system, which really doesn't matter when we saw what we saw. We can think about not long ago, this kid in Chicago, Laquan McDonald, had PCP in his system. They shot this kid 16 times. And then they said that the PCP made him do it. But then we saw the videotape and we see that the kid was retreating. But had not there was a videotape, the cop would have gotten off. And so drugs are used as a scapegoat in order to allow cops to get away with unthinkable acts, such as the one we saw with George Floyd. But we have a long history of using drugs as scapegoat. As I'm trying to help the public to understand that people shouldn't be persecuted based on what they have in their blood. I mean, a number of people have marijuana in their system now that the drug is legal for recreational and medical purposes in most of the states.
Right. And part of this, what fascinated me was about your work in particular, is because you not only study this in terms of science from a scientific perspective, but also you've been able to connect it to historical baggage of this country, just generation after generation, right? Changing the rules as it pertains to drug use because it became a very useful tool to vilify Black people, and not just Black people historically. You talk about just different points in history. Could you discuss the historical aspect of the transition from casual drug use in this country by the powerful to vilifying Black and brown people and people of color?
Yeah, so let's just go back to the framers, the founding fathers. If we think about like Thomas Jefferson, for example, Jefferson has written about his use of opioids. He loved his opioids, as particularly as he got older, and he's written about this sort of thing. The guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence, and all of the framers loved their psychoactive substances. Now, when Black people started to use substances, cocaine specifically, in the late 1800s or early 1900s, cocaine was legal in the United States. Cocaine was in Coca-Cola. It was in a number of products. Coca-Cola, somewhere around 1900 or right before 1900, bottled cocaine, meaning that everybody bottled Coca-Cola, which had cocaine in it, meaning that it was available to everybody. Before that, you had to go to the fountain drinks. You had to go to the fountains in order to get Coca-Cola, and Black people weren't allowed to go to the fountain. So Coca-Cola was not available to Black people. But when Coca-Cola bottled it, it now became available to Black people. Shortly thereafter, you started hearing these stories that cocaine made Black men rape white women. Cocaine made Black men unaffected by 32 caliber bullets. Yes. Southern police forces moved away from the 32 caliber weapon to the 38 weapon because they said that the 32 caliber weapon wouldn't stop the Black man. And that's how the police departments increased their caliber of weapon. By 1914, we had banned cocaine nationally, and as well as opioids nationally. Opioids, of course, were connected with the Chinese, who were also discriminated against. And so our drug policy is steeped in racism. We don't ban drugs because of pharmacology. We ban drugs because of racism. And in my new book, Drug Use for Grown-Ups, I talk about that sort of thing. I talk about the history. I talk about people like James Baldwin, who in 1986, while everybody else was talking about punishing crack cocaine 100 times more harshly than powder cocaine, James Baldwin was one of the few people who was standing up saying, wait a second, this law can only affect poor Black people, the poor and Black people. And he was right. And so his thing was we should legalize drugs because the drug laws will only be used against poor and Black people. And boy, was he right.
Absolutely right. I also want to dovetail this conversation because we just got through talking about New Jersey's governor legalizing marijuana, and it's almost as if the path to unwinding this racist legislation and history and baggage, all of our people who are in jail, all of our young Black entrepreneurs who had weed businesses in jail, it seems like the path to unravel this is so steep and the hurdles are so steep that we're still talking about trying to legalize marijuana across this country when in fact it is, there are just levels to this thing because drug use and drug sale, like we're at the bottom of the tier in terms of drug use in this country, yet we carry the disproportionate burden in the prison systems. Could you talk about the disparate views in terms of drug use? Because I'm gonna be honest with you, the boys over in Silicon Valley, they talk about microdosing mushrooms all the time. The cats over in was it Steve Jobs who said that he would never hire anybody unless they did acid? So and you're talking about cocaine. Black folk, we ain't got no cocaine money. Like that's just not in our world. That's not in our purview. We don't have that kind of cash. So there's this two different systems when it comes to drug use, even to this day. And we're still just trying to get our young Black men out of jail for selling weed. Could you speak on that?
Yeah, let's start with one of the points you raised last. People need to understand that the illegal drug trade is a multi-billion-dollar industry. That means that it's not being bolstered up or supported by poor people. Wealthy people are in this game. Don't get it twisted. It's too much money involved. That's one. But when we talk about who's going to jail for drugs, let's just take marijuana since you were talking about Jersey. Black people are 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana than their counterparts. When we think about at the federal level, that's at the state level. At the federal level, Latinos, specific Latinos, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, 2/3 of the people who are arrested for marijuana are those folks. And then when you talk about just a general population, prison population, Black men make up only about 6% of the general population in the United States. We make up damn near 40% of all of the prisoners. I mean, so when you start looking at those numbers, you start to see that, we have racial discrimination going on. And our war on drugs is really a jobs program. It's a jobs program that primarily hires white, lower skilled guys to be the law enforcement officers. And that jobs program is predicated on the incarceration of Black and brown bodies. And a number of people are benefiting from this jobs program. The prisons, of course, the hotels and the restaurants that surround the prisons, other industries that surround the prisons, the politicians, they benefit because all they have to say is that, we're going to put more cops on the streets. And they pretend to have jobs for everyone when in fact, these are relatively low-level jobs for relatively unskilled people in our society. And these jobs are there to replace the factory jobs that moved away when the companies left the country, when we're talking about Ohio, Michigan, West Virginia, all of those places where these companies left these Rust Belt towns, and they were replaced with law enforcement officers. And this jobs programs that's predicated on incarcerating people like me.
Now, I followed your work, like I said, since June, and after interviewing you back then, I've been following very closely, and the headlines that are out on you now are quite controversial in terms of how they're framed. And I didn't want to frame this segment in the same way that all the other headlines frame it, because I think it does a disservice to your body of work from my perspective. But now that people have heard the depth and the substance of you, tell us about your openness about your drug use as a Columbia professor, as a neuroscientist. Like it is, all the headlines are saying this Ivy League professor admits to using drugs. But I don't think that's the whole part of the story. Tell us why this narrative is important for you to be forwarding, and then we'll go from there.
You were generous with the headlines. The headlines didn't say that. The headlines are like, Ivy League professor uses heroin daily and wants everybody else to use heroin. I mean, that's what the headlines were saying. So, like I was saying, I wrote this new book, Drug Use for Grownups. And in the book, one of the things that I do is that I call upon professionals, people like me, largely white professionals who are middle class, who I know are using drugs. I call upon them to get out of the closet about their drug use so we can change this narrative about who is actually a drug user. People think of some poor, down and out minority person who is the person who is using drugs like heroin or just drugs in general. And so with this new book, I went around the world, 5 continents, many countries within those continents, and that's just not the story. And I have certainly used heroin. I mean, I haven't used heroin, of course, we are all in a pandemic. And so there's no way to really get any illegal drugs. And so, but if you read the headlines, it's like I inject every day. I never injected a drug or anything like that. I was making a point, and the point that I'm making, the headlines are demonstrating. I was making the point that we are so ignorant, one cannot even admit to using heroin without being slandered, without being viciously attacked, which is, this is what happens. But I am one of the most responsible people you ever want to meet. Hell, I got 2 books coming out this year. I mean, and I have other books. And I have more than 100 papers in the scientific literature. I put my record up against anybody's record. My kids are doing outstanding. And so, you hear these things. I volunteer in my community. I pay my taxes. I do all of these sorts of things. But yeah, people are telling me I need treatment. Shit is wow. It's just wow. And so, I won't go in too much, but some cats, even brothers, nonsense. I won't go to. So I'm starting to get this Miami mean shit. So let me chill with that. I'll chill with that. I mean,
no, I'm laughing. I'm laughing. I want to bring my co-host up on the screen, Rebecca Azor. I'm laughing because you're like, hell, we in a pandemic. Like, but the reason I wanted to go into that part of the conversation is exactly what you said, right? The intentional usage of those headlines to kind of have an inflammatory to get clicks. Let's just be sure the headlines are to get clicks, but the purpose of your work is to push back against the racist narrative that has a unimaginable effect. Actually, I'm not unimaginable. It's a very measurable impact on the lives of young black men in particular, people of color in general. And as you make this push, they have reduced you down to nothing more than an Ivy League junkie. So why then, not why, how do you continue your efforts in the light of the way media and even some people who are friendly to your work look at this scenario now that these headlines have been spun over about you?
Yeah, the major thing that I have to say to people is please read the book. The book is Drug Use for Grown-Ups. It's a book about compassion. It's a book about love. It's a book about taking care of the least among us. And yet somehow these hack journalists have tried to make me the devil, the enemy. It reminds me of what Malcolm X said. Malcolm X said that if you read these newspapers, man, they will have you hating the oppressed and loving the oppressor. I'd be damned if that ain't true. I mean, that's what this is all about. So please read the book. You read the book, and then you'll see what I'm saying. You'll see who the real enemies are. You'll see who are really being taken advantage of in this society. The same old people, the people of color, the poor, the same people are being taken advantage of.
That's powerful. Rebecca, I wanted you to get.
Oh, here I am. So, yes, Dr. Carl Hart, listening to what you said, honestly, in reading the headlines, because that's a lot of what was going around, all of the headlines are in sync. It literally is Columbia professor admits to using heroin every day. It doesn't talk about the book. It just says that's in your new book. So everybody is assuming this man is a heroin addict, right? Because that's what I'm going to get. When I when I Googled you, that's exactly what came up across the board. But in hearing, what you're saying and how you're breaking it down, your story is important to be told by you, because if we leave it into mainstream media, it's definitely going to sound like you're some kind of drug addict. You're a druggie who's irresponsible. Although your book literally is saying drug use basically for adults, how to be responsible with drugs, and talking about, if we can make it fundamental, and decriminalize these drugs, it'll be more powerful in stopping Black folks from going to jail for simple things like that. But not simple, but not even drug abuse, but, just making sure that we stay out of the prison system and for these things that white folks been doing. So, but yes, I do see it, because for me, if you didn't come on the show, tell your story, I would have definitely been like, oh, this man out here, a whole professor just telling folks they need to be on drugs, those kind of things. But there's so much more to it. And that's why I always go back to that. Dr. Carl Hart, this show is literally a safe space for people to literally tell their stories the way it's supposed to be told.
Yes.
So,
yes. Thank you. Thank you. So I want to just say one thing. It's really important for people to actually buy the book. Drug use for grown up. The subtitle is where the action is: chasing liberty in the land of fear. And I'm trying to help people to understand what that liberty means, what the Declaration of Independence promise to you means. It means you have the right to live your life as you see fit, as long as you're not disrupting anybody else's ability to do the same. And I'm asking people to read the book so they can really interrogate what this means for them, and they can see how they haven't been, the promise has not been delivered to them. And in terms of like drug addicts, that's why I'm here. I'm here to take the arrows for drug addicts, because I'm a tenured professor. I mean, I have books. I know how to do this sort of thing. They don't have my sort of platform. So imagine how people who don't have my platform get killed. But that's why I'm here. I'm here to take the bullets for them. And so we cannot ridicule them. We cannot besmirch them. We cannot attack them. They are people too. And that's exactly why I wrote the book.
Well, one last fine detail on this, then the disparate treatment in regards to how we perceive drug use and drug users and quote unquote drug addicts, right? It's prevalent. I mean, you've already mentioned to it. You alluded to the fact that you face some of that from our own people, right? From Black folks, from kinfolk, right? But then on the flip side, as a society, we have moved towards this period of compassion with regards to opioid overdosing, and we see now that treatment and that shift towards compassion didn't come with the crack epidemic; it came with the opioid epidemic. Could you speak on that before we get out of here?
Yeah, so I wrote a piece in the New York Times, I believe in 2018 about this, the opioid treatment, Black versus white, crack, and opioids. The bottom line is that we did have compassion for crack. If you really go back and you look, white people went to treatment for crack. Black people went to jail. The same thing is happening now. When we look at something like heroin, 80% of the people who are being prosecuted at the federal level are Black and brown. Meanwhile, white folks are going to treatment. It's the same program. I mean, if this is the way we have behaved since the inception of this country, and I write about this in my book from a drug perspective. We can think about my book, for example. I wrote a book called Drug Use for Grown-Ups. This year it was published. And then a couple of years ago, the writer, Michael Pollan, he wrote a book called How to Change Your Mind, talking about him using psychedelic drugs and so forth. No salacious headline, none of that shit. It's just the bestseller. That's all it is. I mean, and so it ain't. Don't get it twisted. I mean, it ain't complicated. It's the same nonsense.
But because it's being given, they don't like the person who's the messenger. So when when the messenger is Black, when the messenger looks like you, because let's be real, they're not going to focus on you being a Columbia professor. They're not going to focus on those things. They're going to be like this Black man with dreads talking about using drugs, he's a druggie. And then the white man
more than that, a Black man who knows what the fuck he's talking about. That's the thing, so and so bring it on. Just bring it on.
Bring it on.
I'm one of the most responsible people they will ever meet because I know the shit's coming. So I'm ready. I work out every day. I'm ready for this.
I love your energy with regards to this because of the level of frustration I can imagine. The entirety of your life's work. You've been doing this for 25 years, right? And the entirety of your life's work, 30 years. And your body of work is being reduced by headlines into something that is dismissive of your body of work. So I understand the frustration. I just want to highlight it with one last thing. There's a series on Vice TV where the host of the series experiments with drugs, psychedelic drugs, all kind of drugs. The entire point of the series is to do a lot of what you're saying in terms of the perspective of towards drug use and drug users. That said, I haven't heard a single headline about that show the way I've heard headlines about you. And me knowing your work, at least for the last 6 or 7 months that I've known of your work, I knew exactly what was going on with those headlines. And I appreciate the fact that you're here taking the blows on behalf of something way bigger. What you're confronting, and I'll let you get the last word, what you're confronting is the systemic issue of criminalizing drugs as it pertains to Black people and brown people, while everybody else goes to rehab and gets off
or enjoys it.
Compassion.
Or enjoys it and then talk about it on shows.
Exactly. You know, like, let's just, when Trayvon Martin was killed, they said that he had marijuana in his system. That's why he attacked George Zimmerman. I showed up. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times when Sandra Bland was killed. I showed up. They tried to blame marijuana for that. I mean, when all of these people are killed and they try and blame drugs, George Floyd, I show up. And then, you know, I get these attacks from people who look like us. And it's like, what the fuck is wrong with you people? Getting attacked from places like the New York Post, who don't give a fuck about Black people. And it's like, what is wrong with you all? Anyway, if you want to be free, you got to understand that you are slaves. And I'm trying to free you, as Harriet Tubman has said.
Dr. Carl Hart, Professor of Neuroscience, Columbia University. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Love you, meaning Dr. Carl Hart. Next time you come on, we got to make sure we got that bleep button for you. But absolutely, it's a family. It's like we loved it.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yo, you're fine. You're fine. I love your passion and I love what you're doing and I love how you're breaking it down so that people can understand. And that's what I'm going to tell all you guys to do. What's the name of your book again, Dr. Carl Hart? Where can they find it?
Drug use for grown-ups. It's everywhere. Go support your local bookstore. You can find me at drcarlhart.com. The book is there. You can find me on Twitter. Get at me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.